White people are afraid of black people. They are afraid of us. And it's a very interesting thing because black people know it. We know white people are afraid. But you have to start getting into the psychology. What are you afraid of? Why are you afraid? But it's an interesting dynamic. Now, also you see the difference in what racism is, do you not? Racism implies you have not just prejudice, but the power to do something with that prejudice. Now, I don't like you, not only that, but I'm going to control whether you can get, you know, I may say I hate you. I hate white people. I hate them. I hate them. It's not going to change you getting that, you know, loan when you go to the bank. You could go, you could hate, I can hate you all the way to the bank. Not going to change. Do you see the difference? That whereas white racism says, not only do I not like you, but I'm going to change the impact of where you can live. I'm going to determine with that racism where your powers are. You following me?
Would you say you're a victim?
America is very racist. Texas is very racist. Austin is very racist. I am always asked if I'm Chinese and if I know Taekwondo. For all cultures and colors of people, there's a lot of, I don't want to say ignorance, but there's just a lot. Things need to just be changed, and the way we talk about it needs to be changed.
Perception is everything. White people look vicious and ugly and non-caring and cruel and arrogant and powerful and condescending and angry. Are you angry?
No.
Oh, good for you. Are you angry?
Trying not.
Trying not to be. Now, does that take a lot of energy?
Yes.
Yes. Are you holding it in? Yes. And are you trying really, really hard not to react to me?
Yes.
Yes. And are you trying really hard not to look at me?
At the moment, yes.
Yes. Why?
Because I don't want to make myself more upset.
You don't want to make yourself more upset by looking at me.
Yes.
Right. Does that take a lot of time, a lot of energy?
Yes.
Yes. Is that hard for you?
Yes.
Could you develop an ulcer over this?
No.
If you had to do it every day, what would happen to your blood pressure?
It would rise.
Yeah. If somebody stood over you and you knew it was going to happen every day, or you expected it to happen every day, or it happened when you didn't expect it to, or it happened to your kids every day, after it happened to your mother every day. Now, getting right along, your hand is still up. You still didn't learn anything, did you? Didn't I just say when your hand is up, you are thinking of what you're going to say instead of what's being said? Didn't I just say that?
Yes, you did.
And did you hear that?
Yes, I did.
And did you decide that you were just going to do it your way?
I was.
Wait a minute, you were on a roll there for a minute.
Yes,
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, I did.
Now, since you choose to not listen to others, what do you suppose we're going to do where you're concerned?
No, listen to me.
Thank you very much.
May I finish what I'm saying,
No, because you're still thinking of what you're going to say instead of what I'm saying. Now, getting right along.
I heard what you were saying.
You're doing it again.
What you were
You're
saying.
doing it again.
I don't care.
You're doing it
because
again.
It's wrong.
You're doing it again.
Persecuted her for standing out.
You're doing it again.
Persecuted him for standing out. The only change that ever happens is when people stand out, and I am standing.
Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. Are you in any physical danger here? Are you in any physical danger here? Is that girl in any physical danger here? Emmett Till was hanged by his neck after he was beaten almost to death, simply because he said...
So, I have this specific question and I want to ask you, do you think God is dead? We buried God and we attended his funeral. We humans, we killed God. And so after killing God, the one true God, we were left with no morality. We were left with will to power and eternal recurrences. The will to power is, there is no an objective, there is no moral objective which sets the standard. Anybody can act how they think. And eternal recurrences is that things always occur, random things reoccur. Even things which happened in the past can occur in the present and still affect people who are up to date. This argument of humans killed God, we attended the funeral and we buried him is a concept that was brought about by a philosopher called Frederick Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher who came up with this concept. And so somehow in the past, people buried God in their minds. Because what I'm about to tell you right now will convince you this is what these people had in their mind. Because if they really believed there is a supreme being, they wouldn't have done what they did to the Africans. Yes, I'm speaking about the colonizer and the slave masters. Colonization and slavery are challenges that have been faced by Africans, by black people. Yes, anywhere a black person is, he will always face oppression. The other day I was studying some research paper and I discovered that, I've always known this, I discovered that we have Aboriginal people in Australia. Being the Aboriginal people of Australia, the people of Australia, which majority is the white, are kicking them away. Actually, the Aboriginals are living the worst life over there. They really don't care that there is somebody who is watching and somebody who can just decide and just by the click of their hand, wipe them away. That is God. He is all that powerful. Yes. Now, I want us to talk about Joy. Professor Joy de Grey. Professor Joy de Grey introduces a very interesting argument about slavery. Not colonialism, but slavery. She introduces a concept which is called, in psychology we have the post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And now she calls this post-traumatic slavery disorder. There is that trauma which Africans are facing up to date. The thing which I was telling you, the eternal recurrences. It's happening. Children who are still born today are still facing PTSD. S for slavery, not stress. They are still facing this. They never experienced slavery, but they're experiencing it in the modern world today. And that is what we want us to listen from Professor Joy de Grey. She has a very interesting argument. I want us to listen to this video. After listening to this video, I'll give you my critical analysis and what I have gathered and what you can learn. Without further ado, let's listen to Professor Joy de Grey and have a critical analysis later on.
How many of you are familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder? Yeah. Okay. So these are things, I mean, most of you are people who are in the field that have done the work. You're here representing the people who are really in the trenches, and I appreciate and respect that. The theory very often, when people hear it, post-traumatic slave syndrome, I try to kind of get at kind of what's going on in the room. There's ambivalence, there's feelings of, what? Come on now. What are we saying now about the slavery thing? It's over. Get over it. We're done. We have that kind of feeling. And how possibly is she drawing a connection between something that happened so long ago in contemporary society? Come on, are you trying to find an excuse? Are you trying to blame people? These are the natural kind of knee-jerk reactions to hearing the term post-traumatic slave syndrome. However, I would submit to you that, it's based on research. So I did about 6 years of research specifically looking at violence. My area of focus is violence. All the people of color that are in this room are arriving in this room at a different level because they have lived in this skin. And we're rarely given any kind of appreciation or understanding of what you have to live with walking through the world with this skin. So you kind of come in at a different level of awareness about the discussion. And then you have folks that come into this discussion that are educated around it, that are clear about it, but can't really empathize their way through it. In other words, it's not a feeling thing, it's a cerebral thing. So some people stay intellectual because that's a level of comfort. Nothing wrong with that. But very different from the person who lives in the skin. It is personal and it is emotional. Okay, so all of that's going on in this room even before we get started. But as people commit it, it may get a bit uncomfortable. But that's okay, because it's been uncomfortable living in this skin. It's been uncomfortable. And we have to learn how to deal with that discomfort and stay in the room. So when we look at the fundamental premise of trauma, and we understand the nature of trauma, we know that there have been other groups that we've looked at the etiology of contemporary behavior based on multi-generational trauma. One group, Jewish Holocaust, families of Jewish Holocaust, and the fact that the Jewish community is very, very clear about honoring that Holocaust. So much so that Spielberg will probably make another movie. And I'm not mad at him, because what he's doing is ensuring that the generations that come will never forget the Holocaust and its impact upon Jewish people. You'll look at folks throughout the world, even Aboriginal folks in the United States, where more focus is being done on what colonialism has done. We've looked at Japanese internment. We've looked at Australian Aboriginal folks. We've looked at multi-generational impact of trauma on people who have had tragedies like the tsunami victims. We'll look at everybody. But when it comes to looking at Africans, there's a visceral response. Oh, come on, let's not. Why are you? And it's a curious thing as a social scientist to me that you get so much pushback when you talk about Africa. And we look at the legacy of slavery. You get so much pushback, but more importantly is why do you get the pushback? See, as a social scientist, I'm less concerned with the material, which I'm clear about. I'm more interested in why the behavior. Why is there such reticence at looking at this issue? And the answer is, when you peel back the layers of this, we peel back everybody's layers. Everyone gets naked in this room, and that's not always comfortable. It's also very comfortable to talk about the other's pathology. And the reason why I think that becomes important is so that when we begin to engage in this discussion, we don't find ourselves falling victim to the fear, guilt, all of that stuff that's not useful to anyone. It's not useful. This means we're going to peel the layers back. And while 246 years, as it were, in American history of American chattel slavery, starting with 1619 to the ratification of the 13th Amendment in the United States, we're looking at 246 years of American chattel slavery. And it's very comfortable, and I think to some degree people can say, you can't have 246 years of trauma and expect that nothing happened, especially when that trauma was followed by more trauma, especially given the fact that there was never a point of healing. Not difficult to do the math here. This is not deep and philosophical. It really makes sense. But you know what else is true? You can't have 246 years of folks engaged in a traumatic experience that were white that went unaffected. That means everybody has been affected and infected by this thing. So that's the part that gets uncomfortable, because it's usually okay to look at the other. We're going to look at everybody. This is going to be one where we really show the elephant in the room, and only for the purposes of recognizing that unless we do so, none of us can heal. This is not a process that any of us can do individually by ourselves. This is a collective process. And so therefore, we're all going to be engaged. And it's not just a pointing of fingers at anyone. It's recognizing that you and I, all of us, have been impacted by historical multi-generational trauma. Now, let's look at it very specifically. When we look at trauma in its very, clinical sense, my background in clinical psychology, understanding what trauma is, people can experience a single trauma, one trauma, indirectly, meaning that they didn't have to be present for the direct trauma. Meaning, say, for example, you all heard about 9/11 and taking down the buildings in New York, right? Yes? 9/11. Everybody in the world got told about that. Matter of fact, I think everybody in America got diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of that. But I would submit to you we were traumatized long before that. But there were individuals that were at ground zero, and I know them. My niece was in one of the buildings. So she decided, while she was in one of the buildings, they kept telling her, just stay where you are. They kept saying, stay where you are. We think people should stay where they are. She said, and everything in her mind said, get out. So she got out. Matter of fact, she leapt over the security guard to get out of the building. And it's a good thing she did. But during that time, there were people at ground zero, for example, like my niece. And there were people who watched it on television. And then there were people in other countries who heard about it. So there are varying levels of understanding around this trauma that happened in the United States. There were people at ground zero, were there, saw folks falling out the sky, got videotape footage of it, watched it on television, invited folks over and drank beer. Not traumatized. No trauma. There were people maybe in another country, in Brazil, saw it on television, in psychotherapy right now. Can't get on planes, on medication, and people talk softly to them twice a week. So the variance in terms of those who are traumatized by a traumatic event and those who are not, we're unique as individuals. Everybody's not traumatized by a traumatic event, whether it's direct or not. But when we start talking about chattel slavery, we're not talking about one trauma. We're not talking about a specific event. We're talking about generations of trauma with no intervention. Based on what I know about sugar plantations, tobacco, the Caribbean, what I know about American chattel slavery and the plantations there, does anyone right now ever recall mental health assistance to slaves? Anybody remember sending in the therapist after I sold off your son, daughter, raped folks? At any point? Never. Second question. After slavery was officially over, now you're free. Anybody remember any therapy then? We know it's been rough, it's been deep for you, it's been difficult. We're going to do a little group therapy. Anybody remember that? That would be no. Number 3, after slavery officially ended, both in the States, in the Caribbean, the British ended, do you remember whether or not trauma continued? Did the trauma continue for people of African descent? I need to know. Okay, so now let's do the math. Hundreds of years of trauma, no treatment. Freed, more trauma, no treatment. What do you do the math? Do you think there may be residual impacts of that trauma? Of course there is. It didn't end, friends, and it hasn't ended yet. So I think on one point, African people and people of African descent are extremely resilient. Matter of fact, I think we're a miracle. Far be it for us to pathologize or to look and cast this idea of weak and sick people. Oh, on the contrary, we are profoundly resilient because we've done everything we've done thus far with no help, with not even the ability to have this discussion. As though it were possible, we escaped injury in all those hundreds of years and the years that follow. So this kind of journey I'm going to take you on is going to be one that really gives a perspective on what this trauma was, what it looks like, and clinically, what is post-traumatic stress disorder? What does it look like? Now, let me give you a little snapshot. We'll get into it in more depth a little later. But post-traumatic stress disorder, if in fact you are diagnosed with that, again, remember, direct or indirect trauma, here are some of the symptoms. A feeling of foreshortened future. Now, what does that mean? A feeling, well, you're not going to live long. How many of you are running into young people that don't believe they're going to make it past their 20s? Feeling of foreshortened future. Exaggerated startle response. Outbursts of anger. Difficulty falling or staying asleep. Hypervigilance. Right? These are symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. This is like DSM stuff, Diagnostic Statistical Manual Mental Disorders. It's in there. And there's a whole listing of all these symptoms. Now, I want to roll it back so you can understand what the transmission theory is, because I'm going to talk about transmission. So how does a person that's been traumatized by post-traumatic, literally has a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, and can we, if we are logical and we are reasonable people, assume that a fair number of Africans had to have had post-traumatic stress disorder? You think? I'm not talking about us, I'm talking about them. Untreated, though, right? Okay, so now let's do the math. Mom, who saw dad sold or sister raped, has post-traumatic stress disorder. Still mom, though, right? Only mom now has outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future, difficulty falling or staying asleep, hypervigilance. That would be mom. Now, Johnny Or Mary or Shaquisha did not have the original trauma. But what are they learning? This is called social learning theory. What am I normalizing? Exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger. Are you following me? So I didn't have to be traumatized. Now, the other thing is, do you think Johnny and Mary got traumatized too? Do you see? So what happens in your environment, you learn from the significant others in your environment. And if they're broken, guess what you're going to be? You're learning from broken people. And you're normalizing that behavior. And then it becomes, years later, 2008, that's their culture. That's just the way they are. That's their culture. So there's poison in the cookies, right? But how are you going to tease out that poison? That means you have to look at the etiology of the behavior, which is what I spent many years doing. And it's not rocket science. This is not deep. Like I said, this is not required that, someone has, it's just common sense. How many of you in the room think you can cook? Come on now. I know it's a strange place. You all have the oddest food in the world. I'm trying to tell you that now. Those of you that know how to cook, who taught you how to cook? Mom, dad, family. Who you think taught them? Hello, social learning theory. You learn from those in your environment. And if they couldn't cook, yeah, likelihood is you can't either. Okay. So there's things that we don't question them. This is what goes in the curry. What are you talking about? This is how you make curry. Well, how you know? Because that's the way my mother made it. Well, maybe, she didn't get the recipe right. Actually, I wrote Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, the book, which is here. The book is called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, America's Legacy of Enduring Injury and Healing. I recently have written a study guide, which is being edited now. But the reason why I wrote the book is really to put a name to what I was looking at. I started to look at behaviors in African people and people of African descent. A long time, people ask me all the time, I just was interviewed by ABC, and they wanted to know, where did this come from? It came from growing up black. No, there's nothing deep there. I grew up looking at black folks and wondering why we behaved the way we did. Very little had to do with white people. Very little. I was looking at black people, and I wanted to understand our behavior. I am 50 years old, and I remember looking at people who were, growing up in South Central Los Angeles. That's where I grew up. My parents are from the South, from Louisiana, and from Belize. And one of the things that I started to notice are certain behaviors that black people engaged in that I started realizing, not just African Americans, African Caribbean people, I came here, heard the same thing, behaviors around what we look like. Like, for example, I would hear people, and most people here, white or black or wherever you are in the spectrum, you've seen the behavior and wondered about it. I know you have, because I wondered about it. Well, you have black people that aren't black. How many people have met black people that actually aren't black? Now, this is an interesting phenomenon. These are black people that will tell you before, first of all, they certainly look black to me. They look black, but they don't say they're black. I've got quite a bit of Indian in me. Did I mention that? A lot of my family are from, all of a sudden there's something else, right? And you're looking going, sure could have fooled me. You look black to me, right? Now, this would be something that I could ignore if it stopped when I was a child in South Central, but it didn't. You could hear it in rap music today. Same behavior. Matter of fact, the rap videos, they just need to clone the same girl, right? I could draw her right now, what she looks like. The little wavy hair, and, she's black, but not too black. Okay? And what is that about? What is its etiology, and why does it persist? That means that it's an intracultural phenomenon that's being passed along through generations. But why? What is this self-loathing that I see in contemporary black folks? I'm not going back to slavery. I'm talking about today, who hate and despise the reflection in the mirror. That's what I wanted to know. So that's what led me on my journey, if you will. Again, not an unusual journey. Of course, I'm going to kind of pop back and forth through British history and American history. James Madison was a very important figure in American history, President of the United States, 1751 to 1836. He said, blacks are inhabitants, but as debased by servitude below the equal level of free inhabitants, which regards the slave as divested of 2/5 of the man. This is called the 3/5 compromise. And what they were trying to figure out is, what are we going to do? How are we going to count these black folks? Because, you know, based on how many people you have residing in a particular state, the more representatives you can send to the House of Representatives, and thus the more power that particular state can wield. So the question was, how do you count the slaves? Well, Southerners, who of course enjoyed slavery, they wanted to count them. They said, yeah, count them. That gives us more power. Where the Northerners saw it as an opportunity to abolish slavery, said, well, you can't count them because you don't consider them human. How can you count people who have absolutely no freedom that you do not count or treat as human beings? So the agreed upon solution is to count 3/5 of a state's total slave population. And so as a result, they became 3/5 of a man, divested of that. But it's almost as though you're not talking about a human being anymore. And that's what's scary about this. And I always start my talks by saying that when you see folks dressed up like this, and I know you all see a lot of them, you should get worried. I always get concerned when I see them dressed up like that, like this guy here. This next guy was someone that I struggled with. You all know him, Richard Oswald. He's the son of a Presbyterian minister, international trader of enslaved Africans. What's so deep about this gentleman is how wealthy he became as a result. He would be worth, based on the 1700s, right now he would be worth $68 million. Based on the number of slaves, the slave trade and colonies, ships, all the stuff that he basically utilized. But again, these folks are held in high regard. When I read about him in your history, you would never know. Google him. You'd never know the ugly trade that he was engaged in because we've sanitized it, you see. It all got kind of sanitized. But what's important is to understand the wealth amassed. And see, this is where people get afraid, particularly Europeans. This is where the whole, oh my God, dare I say the big ugly word, most folks are afraid of, because we don't really care too much about the healing. That healing stuff, go on and get better, you people. But don't try to touch the resources. That would be reparations. We don't want to have that conversation. We're okay if you all go heal, however you're going to do that. But let's not talk about the reparations story. But when you start looking at the wealth amassed, and then you got to look at the Church of England. It gets real ugly, because then you start realizing what is a foundation for the Church of England. Folks that blessed the slave ships. And then, of course, and this is interesting about John Newton, because we all know about, the first thing you hear, John Newton, what's the next thing you hear? Amazing Grace. John Newton, Amazing Grace. Well, let's figure out what happened before he got Amazing Grace. He said slaves are lesser creatures without Christian souls and thus are not destined for the next world. Now, what becomes important about this kind, and you'll see it both in American history as well, there is this kind of dehumanization of African people. Because you got to ask yourself this question: how do people who deem themselves superior, who see themselves as the civilizers, who recognize themselves as what we call manifest destiny, the white man's burden of civilizing all the rest of the races, how do you reconcile being the superior being and engaging in barbaric behavior? What that produces is something called cognitive dissonance. How many people are familiar with that? Cognitive dissonance is really thinking discord. It's when you begin to feel conflict between what you believe or understand or hold to be true, and you are then faced with behaviors, either in yourself or others, that conflict with your fundamental belief. It produces cognitive dissonance. Human beings don't function well with cognitive dissonance. You must remove the cognitive dissonance in order to function. So in order for people to perpetuate slavery and to perpetuate that whole system that lasts for centuries, you had to remove all dissonance associated with it. Can't be anything wrong with me. Certainly isn't us. We're the civilizers. We're the superior. So it must be them. Oh, yes. Well, you see, they don't even have souls. Now I can go to sleep because I'm not really dealing with a human being. Are you following me? Okay, let's see what else he said. He said, when the women and girls are taken on board a ship naked, trembling, terrified, they are often exposed to the wanton rudeness of white savages. The prey is divided upon the spot. Look at the choice of words, the prey. Resistance or refusal would be utterly in vain. And then he says, I sinned with a high hand. Yeah, and then he wrote Amazing Grace. Okay, so it's really important to understand that hand in hand with the behavior was a mindset that is so damaging. You see, I call it the secret.
Now, here is what you should understand. The concept of slave traumatic disorder or post-traumatic slave syndrome was introduced by Dr. Joy DeGray, which provides a profound lens through which we can examine the lasting effects of slavery on black communities worldwide, the historical roots of slavery and psychological impacts across generations, and the contemporary consequences faced by black people globally. Historical context of slavery. I've said these things in this channel a million times. I've spoken the history. But again, for the sake of understanding the concept of Dr. Joy DeGray, to understand PTSS, we first explore the origins of slavery. Slavery as an institution predates the transatlantic slave trade, with roots in ancient civilization such as Mesopotamia and Egypt. However, it was the transatlantic slave trade that exponentially expanded the scale and the brutality of slavery. Now, if you look at these three continents and you try and draw some vector, you'll find a triangle shape. So it's called the transatlantic slave trade or the triangle trade. Now, the transatlantic slave trade was spanning from the 18th to the 19th century, involved the forced exploitation, transportation, exploitation of millions of Africans to the Americas. European colonial powers orchestrated this trade, leading to immense suffering and disruption of African societies. The Middle Passage, characterized by inhumane conditions aboard slave ship, inflicted severe physical and psychological trauma on enslaved Africans. Slavery in the Americas. In the Americas, the system of slavery was foundational to the economic development of colonies. Enslaved Africans were subjected to brutal labor conditions, dehumanization, and systemic violence. Despite these conditions, enslaved people exhibited remarkable resilience, resistance, and survival strategies, which are crucial to understanding the legacy of slavery. Post-traumatic slave syndrome, as told by Dr. Joy DeGray. Dr. Joy DeGray's concept of PTSS draws parallel with PTSD, but emphasizes the unique historical and cultural trauma experienced by black communities. PTSS encompasses multi-generational trauma resulting from centuries of slavery and continued. The trauma of slavery has been transmitted across the generations through mechanisms such as epigenetics, where trauma can alter gene expression. It manifests in various psychological symptoms, including hypervigilance, anxiety, depression, and internalized racism. This reminds me of a theory that I learned while I was still in high school. It was called a theory under evolution, Lamichism. Lamichism is, though it has some weaknesses, it states that humans as we know them, we've had, like, it says that there are some characteristics we can acquire from the environment. And these characteristics, we can pass it down to our offsprings. That is what Lamechism says. Characteristics acquired from the environment can be passed down to offsprings. The same way it argues on this, there's a weakness against this, which says characteristics acquired by the environment from the environment cannot be transmitted through the genes to the offspring. But Dr. Joy de Grey is trying to explain the effects of slavery, and there has been something called epigenetics. In a way, I really don't know what epigenetics is, but from what I can gather from my beautiful research is that there's a way this slavery thing, because it's been from 15th century to 19th century. Come on, that's a lot of time putting people into suffering. A child is born, a child grows old. Another child is born, another child grows old. Another child is born, another child grows old. It's like 5 generations. 5 or even 6 to some people. Or even 10 to some people. Of the same suffering. Eventually, these things has to get inside the gene. It has to get inside the gene. It's like a family. You've always known a family of doing some kind of weird behaviors or good behaviors. In this case, somebody might be, you might know somebody of them doing a good thing, and then you see their children doing the same thing, their grandchildren doing the same thing. It tells you that sometimes characteristics are acquired, which are acquired from the environment, are passed down to the offspring. Somehow, we can be in support of Lamechism if we argue in favor of the effects of slavery. Because we don't need no rocket science. This is not rocket science. It's easy. How much more can somebody tell us about the effects of slavery? We see it every day on the TV. We see it how the black Americans, we see it with how they interact with the police. We see it with how they interact with Africans. This is a real problem. This is a real, trust me when I tell you this. It's a real problem, guys. It's a real problem. This is not rocket science. Sometimes problems we face or we acquire from the environment, we pass it down to our offspring. That's the point, basically. So, we've seen the intergenerational trauma, which she says the trauma of slavery has been transmitted across generations through mechanisms such as epigenetics. That is intergenerational trauma. What about cultural trauma? Cultural trauma involves the loss of cultural identity and heritage due to forced assimilation and cultural expression. Enslaved Africans were stripped of their languages, traditions, and familial bonds, creating a cultural void that persists in many black communities today. Black communities might have that cultural void. I always do some interviews on the streets asking Africans, Kenyans are Africans, right? Yes, Kenyans are Africans. I ask them, you young African, what do you think of black Americans? Let me tell you what those answers, some answers are very, very surprising. And it's a social experiment video. The answers are not predetermined, no. Fresh answers, original answers. You'd be surprised what Africans think of African Americans. And then when I watch on the other side, I try and understand, what does these black Americans think of us then? This is what we think of them. What do they think of us? You'll be surprised. You'll be so much surprised. Even in the comment section, there are some black Americans who insult Africans, including myself. Insults, yes. If I were to open my comment section to you, I don't know if you'd have the heart to continue YouTube. I really don't know. Some are very, very insultive. Very, very, very insultive of how Africans are, how they perceive us. But no, this might be a fallacy of composition. I can't say because these few rotten apples are saying Africans are bad, the whole tree is full of rotten apples. No, these are just few rotten apples which should be plucked and thrown into the fire. Yes, plucked, thrown into the fire. Cultural trauma. It involved the loss of cultural identity and heritage due to forced assimilation and cultural suppression. Enslaved Africans were stripped of their languages, tradition, and familial bonds. That's true. We've seen it happen, you understand? Another thing is psychological and behavioral manifestation of PTSS. PTSS manifests in psychological symptoms such as anxiety and depression, which are compounded by societal and institutional racism. Behavioral manifestation include violence within society. These symptoms and behaviors reflect both the direct trauma of slavery and the continued racial oppression faced by black people. Real-life consequences in contemporary or modern society. Economic disparities. Economic disparities between black and white communities are stuck. The wealth gap, rooted in historical injustices such as slavery and segregation, continues to widen up to date. Employment discrimination and barriers to economic advancement exacerbate those disparities, limiting opportunities for black individuals and families. Another thing is educational inequalities. Educational inequalities persist as significant barriers to social mobility. Black students often attend underfunded schools and face discriminatory disciplinary practices, contributing to the school-to-prison pipeline. These educational disparities hinder the potential for future generations to break the cycle of poverty. We have another thing is health disparities. Health disparities are another critical consequences of PTSS. Black individuals experience higher rates of chronic diseases, lower life expectancy, and limited access to quality health care. Mental health disparities influenced by the historical trauma of slavery and ongoing racism further exacerbate these challenges. So PTSS is just all over the place. All over the place. You understand? The criminal justice system is also compromised. You understand? Criminal justice system disproportionately targets black communities, over-policing, racial profiling, and harsher sentencing contribute to the mass incarceration of black individuals. This systemic racism within the justice system perpetuates a cycle of trauma and disadvantages. Now, I will conclude with, I will say another one is social and cultural impact. The social and cultural impact of PTSS is evident in the underrepresentation of black individuals in media and popular culture. While there have been strides towards more inclusive representation, the legacy of negative stereotype and cultural erasure persists. Simultaneously, there is growing movement to preserve and revive cultural heritage, promoting a sense of identity and pride within cultural community, within black community. Now, there is so much and so much that we can gather from Dr. Joy DeGray, you understand? Global impact and perspectives, diaspora experience. Black communities across the globe share both unique challenges and common experiences rooted in the legacy of slavery and colonialism. In Europe, the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa, the descendants of enslaved people navigate complex racial dynamics and systemic inequalities. Global impact and perspective, that was. Racial dynamics in different countries. We have movement for justice and reparations, global solidarity and alliances. We have healing and moving forward, which is a therapeutic approach. Healing from PTSS requires culturally sensitive therapy and community-based intervention. Education and awareness is also therapeutic. It heals, you understand? Education plays a pivotal role in combating racism and promoting understanding, teaching accurate historical accounts, and fostering critical discussions about the legacy of slavery and crucial steps towards reconciliation. Community empowerment can help, policy and advocacy can help, which policy and advocacy will involve things such as policy changes at local, national, and international levels are necessary to address systemic inequalities and promote social justice. Advocacy for systemic change must be persistent and inclusive, addressing the root cause of disparities and trauma. Yeah. To conclude, this is our conclusion. The legacy of slavery and the resulting PTSS continue to shape the lives of Black people globally. Understanding the historical and psychological context is crucial for addressing the ongoing consequences and working towards healing and justice. By acknowledging the past, educating future generations, and advocating for systemic justice and change, we can strive for a more equitable and inclusive world for Black people, white people, Asians, and all races into one, the human race. Yes, guys, that's all for today. If you enjoy my video, kindly do subscribe to the channel. There is no loss in subscribing to this channel. Do subscribe and give me a super thanks. If you can, like the video, share with your friends and families. See you in the next video where we'll have another critical analysis on issues affecting Black people all over the world.